Ian Siegel, it's a pleasure to see you. How are you this very fine Monday?
I'm great. I had a productive day so far, so it's been a good start. And yeah, it's been an amazing week, honestly. Just I've been on my land doing kind of farm chores and working in tutoring and tutor management and just thinking of some big thoughts along the way. So it's been fun. How about you?
Things have been good. The thing I try to be aware of is I have a few friends and colleagues who the way I think of it inside my own head, right, is they love the feeling of the wind in their hair. They love motion, right? Oh, I did so many things this week. And for me, it's like, it's so easy to get into that mindset of, oh, look at all the boxes I checked. But I know deep in my heart, it's not about how many boxes you check. It's about, did you check the right boxes? And even just the right one box is so much better than like 100 cross-offs. But even though I know that's true, it's hard for me. But what I'm building up to is I've been having a pretty good week. Like, I've been getting some of the right things done. And when I don't have the mental energy to do the right things, at least I'm checking some boxes and keeping moving. So,
For me, the really good thing has been using more time to connect with people and then realizing using that as the basis of kind of like what the boxes I should be checking that we don't check enough. And then, because in my interactions with those people, I always get secondary, tertiary perspectives that are just like, somehow I always use to enrich my experience, my decision making. And I think I specifically feel like the people that I love in my life, I find myself kind of by thinking about what's going on with them and just kind of imagining what that might be. And kind of been confirming or negating that, talking to them. I think really has been interesting. Just in terms of learning, to be honest. And I think, and part of this, I'm kind of trying to introduce this idea that I mentioned leading up to this idea of delocalization of intelligence, and I think, and I'm talking about the deep end, but I let's start with stuff that's
Ian Deep End Siegel. Bring it.
Yeah. Sharks, come at me. But I'm just like, it's kind of a 0 or 1 thing, is it, does ESP exist? Like, when you feel like someone's staring into the back of your head and you can feel it or not, or some kind of just a feeling like something just pops in your head and it feels like it's like an intuition about the emotional state of another person.
Well, see, I have
I was wondering what your thoughts are. Yeah, no, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Yeah.
It's interesting. ESP absolutely does not exist. And yet everything you're talking about is a real thing. And to me, it's like, well, you can't have it both ways. Which is it? And it's like, well, it's kind of a little bit of both, right? And the reason I say that is that all the experiences you're talking about, I think, are part of the human condition. I think that whether they're explainable by scientific means, like I think many of them are, but I don't need science to tell me that I feel pleasure at feeling a connection with someone else. And I know mirror neurons exist. Like, I know that there's a bunch of ways in which we're built to take on somebody else's valence in part in order that we can have a more shared experience together. And it's like, okay, that's good enough for me. You know what I mean? Like, and sometimes it crosses over where you're finishing someone else's sentences. Like that's the gold standard for close friendships, for, life partners, all that kind of good stuff, is that, there are things like that can happen. And, that stuff exists. It's rare, but it's lovely when it happens. And I think the mistake is getting caught up in, well, does it really scientific? I think the real conversation is, okay, what's that about? How can you lean into it in a way that enriches your life, enriches your relationships, And generally speaking, like, brings more good into the world, or at least your little corner of the world.
Well, let me give you an example that's very like, mundane, but something that happens all the time in tutoring with me is if I'm really paying attention to the student, I know the exact moment where I can feel it. And it's a question of whether it is me kind of subconsciously paying attention to cues that are giving me this impression, or the thing you're saying absolutely doesn't exist, which I'm leaving open as a question. But
yeah, no, I don't mean to be bullying you into taking my point of view. I'm just stating it's a strong opinion, loosely held, right?
Yeah. You and everybody else, man. No, not the loosely held part. The strong opinion it is, I feel like I know when they go offline and come back online, basically, to like this kind of feeling of understanding and connection.
Yeah.
And so I have this dyslexic student who I often think I observe are way better at thinking about other people's perspectives. Well, what's that about? Maybe it's, the kind of culture around it, because it's like they're in a non-dyslexic world kind of thing. And so they're constantly like, oh, that's what you see there? Oh, okay, I guess that's it. I've got to think from your perspective. Mm-hmm. But it seems as if that there's some right hemisphere compensation for, the language area damage that happens that kind of gives these students a little bit of a secret power. So I'm like feeling like both ways, like we are finishing each other's sentences far more often than what happens for another student. Mm-hmm. So I just, in that moment, I have the kind of train tracks of all of my past experiences with different students. And so I'm kind of like, there's that conscious expectation, but then I'm matching that, or I'm kind of organizing that with I think an intuition, or it's in that whether the intuition is kind of a question of whether like how much of my like subconscious perceptual stuff is like leading me to that intuition. Like, I'm not directly consciously paying attention to it, but I am picking it up and I'm used to it. Or the kind of, I could be, my eyes could be closed. And because the thing for me that I'm noticing more and more is the more that I really fall in love with the outside world and the people in it, the more I feel like I'm clicking into how they're feeling, no matter the distance. Like my brother, the other day, I was like, he's not doing well. I don't know why. I can tell something's going on. And then I find out later that he wasn't. Now, what does that mean? But I guess my point is that if ESP does exist, then there's no distance shouldn't matter. Would you agree to that?
Well,
accepting the first lemma. Yeah.
If ESP exists, then distance doesn't matter. In the way that I think you mean it, sure, I agree with that. Distance still matters in the sense that we can't share a meal over ESP, but like, is sharing a meal really the end all be all of personal connection? Probably not. Like, okay, fine. Like distance matters maybe, but not really in the way you mean. Like, does it deeply matter? No. If ESP exists, then distance doesn't matter because I'm thinking, I made this friend 20 years ago in Germany, and we haven't been in very close touch, but I do think of him from time to time. Right. Like we had a strong friend connection and, we've emailed sporadically, and he's much closer to me in my mind than either geographical reality or the reality of our communication would lead us to. And sort of having him as an image who's kind of, around is still meaningful to me. Right. Like he still exists in the world. Right. And, I have warm feelings towards this guy. And we had some good shared experiences. So in that sense, the distance doesn't matter either in the physical sense or in the sense of like, oh gosh, it's probably been 10 or 12 months since I've communicated with him by email. We used to at least a couple times a year, had these long emails and kind of catch each other up and all that kind of stuff. And it was nice, So in that sense, and I kind of come back to like, I kind of don't care if ESP exists, because in that sense, even if ESP doesn't exist, distance still kind of doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, I'm not super into the question of like, is it ESP or are you just watching their cues or like whatever? Because for me, it's like, I don't care how you're doing it. What I care is that you're doing it and you're leveraging it in a way that's meaningful for the other people involved. And normally I restrict these conversations to sort of a professional tutoring context, just because that's what we spend all our day doing, right? And in that context, it's like, it doesn't matter why I know what the kid is thinking. What matters is I know what the kid is thinking, right? And I can help because I know. It's like I'm reading the script as we're going.
Yeah, no, I know.
It's really meaningful to know why it's happening, right?
Well, if unless it's real and it's a capacity that could be developed and refined through practice, because it's something that let's just think of, like, forget ESP, just think of the idea of thinking from other people's perspectives.
There you go.
There's a lot going against an individual, specifically a white male in America, in terms of getting you to think from other people's perspectives. It's like it's kind of like when mainstream society is you kind of thing, right. Then there's nothing to kind of be like, oh, that's how it is, and I need to kind of wrap my head around that. And it's something that, like, especially when there's not a lot of intersection of different cultures, that it's not, you just get increasingly provincial, right? Like with that. And that's why I think so many, like islands or, let's say Florence during the Renaissance, were these like intersection of so many cultures where people are, reconciling perspectives. Probably there's some psychedelics thrown in, and, suddenly you have people kind of being able to accept new perspectives and integrate them. So I think there's that. I've said before that, like, the English language is kind of this, it's a colonial, like a colonist language, in that it's not listener oriented, it's speaker oriented. It's kind of like the expectation is the other person will just know what you mean, because of just like, just for example, like, there means three different things. Everything is kind of like, you need to pay attention to my context, and I don't have to worry too much about the words I choose. You better get it, kind of thing. And I think that also, there's no kind of care in the way that, like, hey, there could be a miscommunication, and let me kind of really think from your perspective to make sure I clarify and mitigate the possibility of that miscommunication. Does that make sense to you, Wes?
Well, not only does it make sense to me, but I'm thinking of one particular person in my circle of friends whose superpower is recognized to be that he uses language in a way that is, his language is only ambiguous when he intends for it to be ambiguous because he wants to talk about the double meaning. But he's a very, very unusual person in that he's very easy to understand, because I feel like he's doing just a tremendous amount of work sort of thinking about what it is he means and choosing his words and all that kind of stuff. And by contrast, the rest of us are exactly what you're describing. Like, we're just kind of bumbling through. I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but yeah, what you're saying rings very true for me, that, I got to be paying attention to the context because the words could mean so many things. And that's a frustrating admission for me, because as a trained engineer, I feel like precision is part of what I'm meant to do. And, the evidence is that I don't do it well. It's hard.
Well, my friend told me, and again, I don't buy this necessarily. I just buy it within a framework. I just think that there's different consciousness levels depending on your environment, on literal and figurative levels. But let's just say within most people, like the kind of common worldview, not Ian's crazy worldview, but he's saying that someone who's 2 standard deviations in IQ higher than another person, neither person understands the other person. Because like the worlds that they live in are so, and again, I don't know if I agree with this, but they're so far apart. But I guess I'm just speaking to how smart people often assume too much in the listener, kind of reinforcing what you're saying, that happens more often. Because I think what happens is smart people often don't think from other people's perspective, which, you know, puts the term smart in question. But whereas, like, I don't know, evolutionarily, it seems our brains got bigger because we were thinking from other people's perspective as we kind of got into bigger, larger societies, right?
No, it's like absolutely true. It seems very. I think it would be hard to dispute that a big factor in increasing the intelligence of the entire human race was the fact that survival depended on understanding what the other people in your tribe were thinking about you.
About you, yes, about you, because because if you got kicked out of the tribe, that's dangerous.
Then you were done. Right.
You might be done. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
No, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sorry, what are you gonna say?
So I'm thinking I've had those conversations. You know what I mean? The multiple standard deviations on either side, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that what's true in talking to people who have less of that capacity and talking to people who have more of that capacity, it's the same game in either direction, which is that the more intellectually inclined of the pair is spending a fair bit of mental energy modeling the other person's mind as they go. And the person who's farther down, as it were, has certain ways of thinking about the situation that are mostly opaque to the person on the other side because they have a more subtle, maybe more accurate, maybe more complicated model. And that occasionally leads to some miscommunication. But and of course, in both of those situations, right, what's most important is empathy, because that will bridge the gap. But I'm thinking like I have friends of mine who, yes, 2 standard deviations smarter than I am. Yeah, I could see that. And it's like I talk to, and they teach me stuff, right? And it's you can kind of watch it happen, right? They're throwing stuff into the conversation, and then they're testing how far you can follow, right? And not to put you on the spot or anything, but they're like, oh, well, have you heard of this thing before? No, I haven't. Oh, well, let me break it down for you. Blah, 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 blah. You got that? Okay, great. So and then there's like a smaller leap, and then you get bored, so they take a bigger leap, and like they're clearly just like, I'm just gonna make this be as quick as I possibly can, but I have to be patient, right? I
do. I just relate. I mean, I'm on the other end of you, Wes, but in terms of smarts, but I relate to that nonetheless, you know. And when I'm listening to this book on tape, audiobook, about a biography of David Foster Wallace.
Oh wow! Now see, I mean, I've read a little bit of his work, and I know he's like a really polarizing figure as an author, but I don't really know much about him.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, that person it very much struggles with the exact same thing. Exactly what you described is like the narration describing David Foster Wallace, who, you know, is both brilliant and wants to be seen that way, wants to engage people on this kind of meta, ironic, blah, blah, blah level, and, you know, do somersaults basically, because it's fun, you know, at a certain level. But also it's just, you know, I can just deeply relate to his story. I'm like, this is me, but he had smarter parents than I did. And so he would
that's funny. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, that's just to say that it's interesting also how, imagine this guy is brilliant. He's surrounded by other brilliant people. And one big theme in the book is how late people are to recognize each other's brilliance. Because they're all like this, worried about themselves, competitive. He went to Amherst, and, you know, his main focus in Amherst was getting straight A pluses to, illustrate the genius he knew he was inside, while, battling very severe depression and some hypomania stuff. And I think it's that kind of stuff is pretty common among authors, just the manic writing phase versus, but it's interesting how like psychological, conditions are directly impeding people's ability to think from other people's perspectives. And so impeding the delocalization of intelligence, let's say, for the people it would count for the most. And so I think it's an unfortunate reality. And I think that the thing that's most striking for me is how surprising what we are very comfortable with around social learning, aka learning something from someone else, and trusting that for smart kids, bright kids who are used to pretty much doing things all on their own because they're faster than the class that they're in, or they're competitive and kind of isolate themselves and kind of want to prove themselves rather than just being like, oh yeah, I could just listen to what Ian said. And using even the tutoring session as just like a way to get a very expensive pat on the head, basically.
One of the things that I really enjoy about my job is that I occasionally have that experience of talking to a kid who clearly understands that there's no speed limit, right? Like who just is like, I can move at this speed and people around me don't move at this speed, but this is the speed I like to move at. And I can keep up with them, and you can see the look on their face. Now, sometimes I'm actually keeping up with them and sometimes they're faster than I am, but I have more experience and I can make it look, you know what I mean? But like one way or the other, I can give them the experience of, okay, I'm keeping up with you, and maybe even lapping you. And that's exciting. I think that's great. But I don't want to go too far down this road without acknowledging something else you said that I think is really important. You mentioned some of the forces that sort of play on this stuff. But you alluded to, but didn't get into some of the cultural forces when you talked about being, straight white male and America, all that kind of good stuff. Because I think that one of the qualities of the water that we swim in that's only just starting to get named recently is the notion that we inhabiting that valence can get away with a much reduced quantity of empathy and just sort of stomp on the people around us. And that's always been, if not okay, at least there have been no obvious negative consequences for the person doing the stomping. Right. And the flip side of it is, right, if I'm a member of a disadvantaged group, or if I'm intersectionally a member of multiple disadvantaged groups, or, however wherever that's coming from, some of the impetus that I have to be emotionally aware is fear-based instead of abundance-based, right? On some level, it's like, oh, I have to defend myself against incursions, not, oh, I'm going to be magnanimous and bring everyone in, right? That's not the culture we have, right? So it's like, okay, so we've got some of the people who just don't have any incentive to do it. And the folks who do have incentive to do it are having certain negative based incentive to do it. Right. And so it's like,
I think,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you. You go ahead. Yeah. Sorry. I just wanted to, before I forgot, it just feels like we're dealing in the wrong currency, in the sense that we're thinking about what's fair, and that's important. But I think we should also, because the way that there's this kind of irony about PC culture, because it's like, think from my perspective, just demanding that. And, but it's not very deep, really. It's actually very like skin deep, and it has a lot of associations that we can just kind of connect to those things that you can just kind of use as you wish, I guess, depending on how you feel. But I think like if people who, are get really uppity, I don't know, like get all like That's the wrong word. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a loaded word. I don't think you want in this context.
Yeah, thank you. Cut that out, Angel, please.
Yeah, exactly.
If you get, yeah, no, well, that's a good example right there. So like that word itself, right, has this like loaded thing where it's like,
right,
you say it and then boom, Ian's a racist, you know, because he's like, again, not carefully choosing his words right there, like not thinking about the historical context and that someone's great-great-grandfather was called that by a slaveholder, basically.
Well, let's pick that apart. I mean, I think there's a lot there. Yeah. So the first thing is, all right, let's have, you know, two white guys in America talk about this stuff. Yeah, well, I mean, you know, it's like, I think that, you know, if there's anything that's going to get us clicks, it's going to be this conversation. And unfortunately, they're all going to be the kinds of clicks we don't want. But in service of actually diving into this thing, like, let's talk it out. And if we look like idiots, then we look like idiots, and that's fine. Yeah. But I think any reasonable person would say, look, do the work. And being bad at the work is no reason not to do the work. Mm-hmm. So let's get into it, and maybe we'll be foolish, yeah. But like whatever.
Fifth grade level. No,
exactly.
Yeah.
It's like being wrong is an important step on the way to becoming right. So great, let's be wrong together or whatever. But and
part of that is actually like my experience of life is very different than a lot of people, because the reason why I'm lax, I think, about my words may have less to do with the fact that I'm a white man. That's part of it, because I'm not like in the public sphere, I'm not as careful. Mm-hmm. But part of the other thing that's lowering my carefulness is that the relationships I have with most people are based on a lot of one-on-one time, you know, a lot. So to the point where it's like, you know, we're all platonic love, everything's good. Say whatever you want, because then we'll work it out, and that kind of, any kind of friction that happens, good. So we can, you know, learn from it, get better, and, you know, integrate that. But I think that's better, that messiness, and then the like, oh wait, we're all here together and everything's good. Remember, we all love each other, I hope. That is less of the walking on eggshells, fear-based stuff that I feel like is really prominent in the Bay Area, you know, to the point where it feels a little like, whoa, I really have to be careful. There's like any word in the dictionary is fair game at this point. So as like for canceled, being called canceled or whatever.
Yeah, no. The thing is, like, in large part, I disagree with you, despite the fact that you're not wrong. And that's the place where it gets tricky, because what I see is there is the intention to be more aware of privilege, the intention to be more aware of historical wrongs, the intention to be more inclusive, the intention to be more sensitive. And these are like, any reasonable person is going to tell you, like, that's good. Like anything, yes, I'm sure you can take it too far, for sure, but like it's a good direction. The place where it gets tricky is that, I mean, I've experienced this from both sides too, right? Someone does something and you have the sense of like, that is beyond the pale. Like that should, like that is, do you know the Overton window?
No, I don't actually.
It's this really interesting cultural idea that there's stuff that everyone agrees is like proper, and then there's stuff that's like a little bit fringy, and then there's stuff that's like, okay, that's inappropriate, and then there's stuff where it's like, okay, that's crazy. Okay. But it's this spectrum where, like, you know, and it gets applied politically, right? The notion is that like the Overton window of what is acceptable to political party X has been shifting over the years. And indeed that is true, right? The Overton window on the right has been shifting rightward, and the Overton window on the left has been shifting leftward. And that's part of what you're talking about, right? Is the notion that like calling you out for using the word incorrectly has become not only acceptable, but demanded in some circles. And if it's demanded for me and insulting for you, if our Overton windows are out of sync, okay, now we have a communication problem.
And I hear all of that, but my challenge with it, and kind of bringing it back to the original topic of like,
wait, we had original topic?
I know, this is wild for us. Delocalization of intelligence.
Oh, right, yes, of course we did. It's right there in the title. Go on.
that it's just it's like, sounds like a rule book that we've created outside of our shared perspectives, rather than focusing on kind of having some philosophical thought through of like framework that you're approaching life. That makes sense. Those might be the rules, but they're more of an algorithm than literal, like this, don't say this, don't say that. It's just come with this framework, come with this perspective overall, and then otherwise match that with what you think the other person might be thinking, and do the best you can. and if you screw up, hope that someone can listen enough that they can hear who you are behind it, and again, this is all extremely hopeful. But what I think is possible when their stress levels are lowered. Because I think if we kind of think of this on that polyvagal ladder thing, and just to explain that, is vagus nerve is responsible for controlling your sympathetic and parasympathetic responses. So if you,
degree to which you're like emotionally activated.
Exactly. Thank you, Wes. Yeah. So activated anxiety, depression, it can go to, that might not sound like activated, but that's, I believe, the dorsal part of your dorsal ventral of your vagus nerve is basically the play dead response, or where you vacate, kind of, which I've had my fair share of depression in the past, and you kind of feel that, and that's an activation. And you'll notice that outside world isn't coming in like, good quality, like Netflix at home with fiber optic, cable stuff. It's fuzzy stuff, and more kind of projecting out, or nothing at all, just kind of or anxiety, or just distraction, right? ADHD, I would encourage everyone to think of it as an emotional challenge more than I would think of it. I would want people to think of it as a learning disability. And I think more and more people are coming on board to that idea, because you'll find that kids in, moldy schools who eat sugar all the time, and, all that, are in an activated state, which is, and if you bring them back down from having neural inflammation, they're not as distracted, they're present, right? Because then I think that's the piece that to pay attention to.
I think it's important to acknowledge here that there are a couple of different listener profiles that you're speaking to, and they're probably hearing it in different ways. And I'm being completely serious when I say that, because for some people, no amount of not eating sugar is gonna address their fundamental struggle with ADHD for whatever reason. And yet for some people, it's like that's the core of it, right? So I think it's important to disclaim that by saying, look, it's not like you're saying this is the cure for ADHD, but what you are saying, and I do agree with it, is that what we think of as ADHD, or any of these diagnoses, is, of course, a grayscale spectrum, right? Once you get past a certain line, we say, okay, you have the condition. But like at the end of the day, everyone has more and less ADHD moments, days, whatever, right? It's just that some of us have a diagnosis and we take medication. Some of us are on the line, and some of us are never going to be close to that line, whatever, but we're still moving around this spectrum. And I think it's absolutely true that there are environmental factors and internal factors that lead you to be more or less, in one direction on that spectrum. And that's legit, right? For me, it's not about curing my ADHD. It's about recognizing that my level of focus fluctuates. And there are things that I can do to increase or decrease that level of focus. And insofar as I'm having a good day, I'm going to lean into the stuff that increases focus. And I know, as sure as I'm sitting here, that I have some days where I'm like, I'm just going to do the thing that decreases focus, because it's a rational response. No, because I'm deregulated in general, and I'm beyond the point of being able to help myself. Like I'm too stressed, I'm too busy, I'm too whatever, and I can't be good to myself in that way. And eating a chocolate covered pecan is going to make me feel better in the moment, and that's what I do. And then yeah.
Mental note: chocolate covered pecan. Got it. Now I know. Yeah.
Delicious. not necessarily good for you, but so tasty.
Here's my challenge to that.
Okay.
I agree mostly, but I would say it is more like you can track the science to it, cause and effect, than what you're describing. And I'm happy to be proved wrong.
Sure.
But I haven't been yet. Not that I've had a lot of anecdotal examples, but I'm pretty much spot on. So we know from experts that ADHD has to do vaguely with genetic plus environmental factors. That's what they've said. You know, that's what the experts out there are like. Basically, it's this, we think, at some level. And I think that there's always a cause to that, to every effect. It's just a question of whether we know it or not. And it might be far more complicated than we're able to kind of consciously integrate at this point in our existence or whatever. But in this case, I actually think this is settled science. It's just kind of, we have future, present, and past in pockets all over the world. What I mean by that is that, you know, some people are more advanced. Yeah, not everyone's up, and some people are behind on technology and all that. So we know that there are HLA types on chromosome 6 that have to do with immune function, our kind of fundamental learning system, this me, this not me, all that kind of stuff. And that 24 to 26% of the population, at least in America, has these genes, which makes it very challenging to rid the body of specific biotoxin sources. So my point is, there are all these things in modern culture that cause neuroinflammation and stress, you know, chronic stress and anxiety, all these things. But the one that is the most significant is the one that's hiding in plain sight. And it's so important because and based on my experience, and I think this is what you're describing too, is that like, it's like as if there's like a cup of inflammation in everybody's body. And, you know, you get this, you know, this source of stress, which might be just your day-to-day like experience of work. Or then you come home and get in a fight with your spouse or something like that. And then it's like, you know, that's one. Then there's like, you ate a hamburger from McDonald's, right? And you're like, I feel kind of like gross or whatever. But the things that, the reason why both of those feel more like, wow, this is a lot for me, in my opinion, is that there's this kind of sneaky one that's the most significant, the one that's hiding in plain sight, which to me is the new lead paint of today, which is that people live at crazy rates in indoors where it's not healthy. And like, if you take for breathing in indoor air, basically, if you take a mold test or actinomyces, which is the biggest culprit that's created by the EPA, and you swipe any school, like you would get probably 90% plus that would say your child shouldn't be here, according to the EPA. You know, if you have this genetic predisposition, which means, like, to me, this could describe the kind of, because it lines up with the percentages of people who have ADHD and anxiety. And at least a good portion of them, as opposed to having it for other reasons, which I could think of as getting exposed to chemicals and stuff, or something that, you know, would make a lot of sense, that you just be like, my brain's inflamed because of my exposure to blank. But that's why I encourage everyone to get their HLAs checked, because for me, I used to have ADHD and I still have it, but it's so different. Like, it's not like
you're at a different place.
I feel like it's like it's like on the way out. And so what I notice is people have kind of favorite activation responses. Like they go to distraction more often, or they go to depression more often, or they go to anxiety more often. And I also would say that, you know, that someone's in a really bad state if they're doing not their favorite. Then that means they're doing their favorite and they're doing other ones too. And it's like, so when I was really in a bad place with this chronic illness called chronic inflammatory response syndrome, kind of makes sense. You're just constantly
CIRS.
Yeah, like I would like, you know, experience all of these like cycling one after the other. And I'm like, I'm not an anxious person. Normally I'm a distracted person, maybe depression. I mess with that. But this anxiety, this dread, holy cow, this is new,
Okay.
and the other piece about it is, I know the CEO of Mindprint Learning, Nancy Weinstein. I think you know Neil, and you may have met Nancy also. Very smart lady, both of them great people. And she's saying, she's like, more and more kids have both anxiety and ADHD, and I'm like, I feel like that's a bad sign, and like, hey, this is all part of like, it's kind of like my MIT appeal is, often think, solutions should be elegant and simple. And I think that when your brain's under fire, you fictionalize a lot. So we've come up with all these explanations and different conditions. But what if it's just like toxin plus specific gene, or but not, I wouldn't say it's not that like simple with the brain. It's like, a certain combination of things that, lead to something. But, you could crunch that down and figure it out. And that means autism. That means dyslexia. When you sprinkle either, these toxins that people can't get rid of from their body on top, because people have chronically high levels of cytokines. And you can test this for $10 by taking what's called a visual contrast sensitivity test. And, it basically what happens is, and this is peer-reviewed research, if your cytokine levels are high, your brain inflammation is high, which is cytokines are a direct, and the audience may have heard of cytokines because of cytokine storms with COVID. This is what actually kill people. Okay. And is the response by the toxins that COVID produces. Okay. But it has a direct relationship with the inflammation levels of your brain. So I'm envisioning a world where, like every week kids like, let me do this vision test to see if I'm actually learning, so I can actually tell, because when you're in your own kind of activated state, you're not that self-aware. You're not aware of other people, and because you're not even that aware of yourself, and you find yourself getting in arguments in the grocery line or something like that, and you're just like, it doesn't seem to make sense. Oh, Wes, I lost you there for a second. Why can't I hear you?
Sorry about that. That was my fault. So you're unaware of your own reduced capacity is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to be aware of that,
Okay. So in order to pull away from the conspiracy theory, cliff or whatever, let me ask you about this. So you've had this visual test, or this test that has visual in the name of it, that tests HLA, you said.
No, sorry. So let me slow down. So your HLAs are genetic components on chromosomes that you can get tested to see if, like, do I have the genes that make
Are you one of the 1 in 4 people is what the...
Yeah, that could be. And then if you're alive and, work, in modern society, it's likely you've been nicked by just walking into buildings or getting COVID, and maybe you don't realize that your conscious reality is dimmed a little bit since COVID.
I get that.
You don't even think of yourself as having long COVID, but you're like, am I a little bit more depressed? I don't know. Maybe I am, than I was before, and it hasn't gone away really, kind of stuff. Subtle, but there, and if someone's and what I'm noticing is if someone's in a moldy house and gets COVID, that's when you start to notice more things, because the stressors kind of are stacking on.
Okay, so you've had some kind of test that determines you're one of the 1 in 4 people who's especially.
Yep. So I know I'm one of the chosen. Yeah, and then
the thing that distinguishes
BCS
you.
Test,
I'm going to take this real slow because I want to make sure I understand what's going on here. So as 1 in 4, the thing that's different about you from the 3 in 4 is that your body's ability to remove this particular kind of toxin is reduced.
It's not there. It's non-existent.
Oh, it's non-existent. All right. So you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So imagine we have 2 immune systems, where our innate one, which has to do with our allergic response and all that, and then there's our adaptive one. And what happens is it's a miscommunication. You know, it's like, hey, something, you know, your innate one is firing off, and there's supposed to be a handoff, and then your adaptive takes care of business. And 3 out of 4 people, no problem, right? But the 1 in 4, and I wouldn't say no problem. That you get into a bad enough situation according to these doctors that some people can get flipped, and have this disease. But yeah, this makes you susceptible. So your innate system's like screaming, "Hey, buddy, what's going on?" And this guy's like, "I don't hear you." And so what happens is just your parasympathetic nervous system just won't kick into gear. And this is people who find themselves, their minds are racing in the middle of the night, usually at 3 a.m. They find themselves waking up because what's happening is there's stress in their brain that's activating the left hemisphere. So they're getting the kind of self-talk when they should be dreaming on the right hemisphere. And again, people might say, well, it's because I had a very stressful day. And my question to them would be, well, why? And I think that a lot of people make better decisions when their brains are clear, that basically obviates the possibility of so many stressors, and in my experience, improves your ability to tolerate and learn from them rather than to get activated by them. Because it's like that inflammation cup. It's like, for me, it was like, you know, 9/10 of the way full. So I was just one learning experience ends up being, a reason to scapegoat, basically, to be like, hey, something's wrong with the outside world, and I'm so stressed by it, rather than kind of a more internal awareness and an ability to kind of deal with it. So that's my experience of it. And, you know, it could be conspiracy, but it's definitely not, but anyone who thinks it is, I would encourage just to prove me wrong. And that's what I think is what smart people owe each other more these days, is prove. And this is what I tell my students. It's like, hey, instead of thinking of smarts as like what you know versus me, let's what you know versus the test in the SAT, for example, which I tutor a lot. Yeah. And so they're always worried about proving themselves. I'm like, this is a fucking team sport, you know? And like, so the way this game works is I give you some advice, and I'm going to ask you all the right questions. So it seems like your idea almost. And then you're going to incorporate that advice. And if it doesn't work, you're going to be like, hey, Ian, this is your fault. You know, like you were wrong. And then that's data for me to use to then adapt and then say, oh, get a little bit cleaner on it. And I think that's what I've noticed with this thing, is that people are very resistant to explore it for themselves. And I understand it's kind of like it's another thing. But I'm not saying you do, Wes. I'm just saying in general, I've had a lot of conversations with people about this, as you can imagine.
Sure.
And I think that I don't know. It's just like, even in my own family, I'm like, hey, I think we have the same genes, you know? Yeah. And I'm like, so, and I almost died learning about this. You seem to share some similar challenges as me, family member. Do you want to, like, would you want to check this out?
Well, hang on a second. So
imagine just one second. It was just like, I've said that to about 8 different family members. Crickets. Family members.
No, I get it.
I mean, it's health stuff, which is, it's hitting on something that people are really like about sometimes because they live with pain for a long time, I think.
Well, no, you're losing me too. Let me wind us back to a place where we can lock arms and walk down a path that'll get me to where I can understand where you're coming from. Okay, so I'm going to say some things that I think are non-controversial to start. Okay. I think we agree that being up at 3 a.m. and having your mind racing is something that more than 25% of the population can relate to. That's something that's a common human experience. I'm not saying that it happens to everyone all the time, but once in their life or more, most people have had that experience. Is that fair?
Chronically is what I'm saying, but yes.
Okay, that's fair. But I don't mean to conflate the chronic with it, but yeah, but my point is that that's an experience that everyone can relate to on some level.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can also agree that the particular mechanism that you're talking about, this gene, the HLA gene, and so forth, is responsible for somewhere between 0 and 100% of the chronic manifestations of this thing. Clearly, it's somewhere between 0 and 100%. Now, that's not saying very much. That's not very helpful to say, but surely we agree that it's somewhere between 0 and 100%, right? Yeah. And as far as I can tell, your position is that it's on the higher end of that 0 to 100% scale. And because I have no direct experience or data, it's rational for me to guess that it's on the low end of the scale because there are so many factors that could be incorporated. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying that you have different experiences and different data from what I have, and therefore we have different starting expectations of how it's going to play out.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we agree on all the parts except what the number is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so what I'd like to hear about is, tell me, actually, there's one more clarifying point. You said that there was a $10 test. Does that $10 test give you some insight into the quantity of toxin that's currently in your body such that you can get some measure on how much effect you should expect to be seeing from this condition?
Exactly. And that when you're treating it, you're kind of watching the levels change in the right direction as a way to judge your own well-being, basically. Yeah.
So would it be fair for me to assume then that what's happened is that at some point along the way, you through whatever mechanism, you came to understand, okay, this is a condition that I believe I have, and that I'm now going to get some regular testing, and you've watched that number move around, and you've matched that number against your subjective experience from day to day or week to week or whatever, and you've observed some kind of correlation that makes clear to you that when this number is higher, life is like this, and when the number is lower, life is more like this. And it's just, at this point, it seems like it's just as plain as the nose on your face that okay, there's there for you.
Yeah, for example, if I have a student where I'm we talk about 5 problems, and I'm let's just review what we just did. And it was as if it didn't happen. And then I say, hey, parents, would you be willing to just try this kind of neuroinflammation test just to see what's going on? Through the roof. Clockwork. So I've done that. And that's
right. So it's not just your own experience. It's also, it's also third-party experience where you're seeing what you take to be signs, and the data seems to corroborate what you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And again, this test isn't saying, hey, it's mold. It could even be you have heart disease, right? But I think it's awesome just to think that we can tell whether we're in a learning state or not for children, for ourselves, and make decisions based on that, based on the state of our mind more accurately than the kind of clicking a little too late, I think.
Well, hang on a second, because there's more accurately encompasses a lot of things. Again, it's a 0 to 100%. If you're saying that this is practically a test for how receptive to new ideas someone is, that's a very different statement from this has a small effect on someone's ability to learn, except that it has a large effect on some people's ability to learn, right?
Well, all I'm saying is not forget the genetic predisposition, but just whether someone is highly neuroinflamed or not is a very close to a guarantee about whether they're going to be behaving in a positive way toward learning, and especially social learning, or acting antisocially, which comes with being active.
Let me read that back to you. Well, we're about to find out. So I think what you're telling me is not that this test measures a certain toxin level, but rather
toxin level, yes, but not the specific source.
Well, and that's what I'm trying to tease apart here.
Or response to something,
it's
the level of response. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Yes. So what I'm trying to sort out is it the kind of thing where for 1 in 100 people, this test will match up with how, how much neural inflammation they have, or it's like, no, it's a test of neural inflammation. That's what it is. And we don't know where it comes from person to person. We just know that they're going to have an effect. In other words, if I go take this test and it says that I have a very high, in other words, bad level, right? Does that mean, like, if 100, actually, let me put it this way, 100 people go and take the test, all of us come back with a very high level. Does that mean all of us are going to be learning impaired? 25% of us are going to be learning impaired? Some of us are going to be learning impaired? Like, what is it that we're testing here, and how does it relate to the?
Based on what I know, it's very accurate if it's high. What's on the other side, though, there are inaccuracies, which is you can still be neuroinflamed and pass the test. For example, if you've been a pilot or something that involves a lot of visual acuity, there's your brain is, and this is so perfect in terms of describing learning. They've made that level of visual acuity integrated, so it doesn't take much cognitive effort to detect those subtle contrasts. Whereas, and also women, I think like 10% of women, that you can't tell, like it doesn't, but again, that's on the opposite side. If it's high, and I mean, everyone's wearing glasses, you have to have at least 20/50 vision with correct vision. If all that's true, then this is peer reviewed stuff.
Okay, so the false negative rate is somewhat high, but the false positive rate is pretty low.
Exactly, false positive is low.
Yeah. Okay, fine. So if you go and you take this test and you find that you have a high level, that indicates that, well, let me say the strongest version of this that I think I hear you saying, because I'd like you to either affirm that this is right or show me that I'm wrong. It sounds like what you're saying is, if I go and get this test, and if I have a high level, then bringing that level down, however I do it, is very likely to lead to better outcomes for me in a learning context.
That's why it's so important. Exactly.
Okay, and now I understand why you're beating this drum so hard. Okay, now I get
because
it.
think about like because also we are like, our biological reality is that we don't pay attention to discomfort until it hits a threshold, but it affects our subconscious awareness and changes our perception. So suddenly we're like, wait a second, Ian, you're going to act like a shit ticket today. Pay attention, buddy. Right. Helpful information, right? Like, and that thing that you think is an intuition, that's a projection, buddy. Because I know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then to trust that the intuition is an intuition, that's more accurate when your brain is in a good spot, right? To have that second level check on a neurological level, I think powerful.
No, I get all this. And this rabbit hole is looking a lot more appealing now. Okay, so you said that the test is inexpensive. What's involved in getting this test? You said it's a visual acuity test, so it's not a blood draw or something. You go to some facility where they have this test and they measure your ability to track stuff in some particular way that gives you a rating. Is that kind of the idea?
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, you can play with this. I mean, imagine tutoring.
Is there a web-based one, or is there like, where do I go?
Survivingmold.com. So they use it specifically for that purpose, because these doctors use it. And you sign up for like a test or two. I think it's like $12, $10, something. And it's the first test I ever failed. First test I ever failed with. So I was. So good luck.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know which outcome to hope for, because if I go and it's a low score, it's like dodge the bullet. But if it's a high score, it's like, oh, maybe there's something I can do that will, that will remove some barriers to success for me in various ways. I mean, I don't mean to sound like a pitchman for this thing, but you seem pretty convinced, and you've laid it out pretty clearly. And it's like, it's a pretty low barrier to entry to collect a little data here. What the hell?
Exactly. And then you kind of like, hey, maybe I shouldn't judge myself so much, because this is me, my brain reacting. I mean, that's another piece of it. And I think that kind of self-awareness that it really brings up, it just creates a healthier relationship with the self.
No, that's very
and
real
other
to
people.
Me. Yeah, it's very real to me. I'm a member of any number of social groups that birds of a feather flock together, right? So I have some social groups that are, generally speaking, known to, not surprised, right? Some of my friends are from MIT, we're engineers. There's a lot of introversion there. There's a lot of, sort of being somewhere on the autism spectrum. There's a lot of qualities there that go along with that sort of folk. And whenever I take screeners for this sort of stuff, right? It's always interesting to me because sometimes I come out like, yeah, you're just a member of the population. Sometimes it's like, no, you're a member of that group in the ways that group is known, or on the borderline or whatever. But every time one of those comes back, it's not like, oh my gosh, I need to get some medicine for this. It's like, okay, now I understand myself a little better. I can be a little gentler with myself. I understand my relationship with these people. I understand my relationship with other people. There's just, that exploration.
Because what happens is there's extra layers of stress that people put on top at because of the self-judgment part.
I should be blah, blah, blah. Totally.
Right. So it's not just the pain itself, but then there's the second level and third level.
Compounding factor. Yeah.
The compounding. Yeah, exactly. And I see that so much with sensitive, bright kids. It's something that is, yeah, absolutely.
I think it's safe to say that we see that with everybody. Although obviously, if you tend to be sensitive and you tend to be more receptive to this stuff, obviously it's going to be even worse. But it's not like sensitive, bright kids have a lock on self-recrimination.
No, I'm just sorry. Yeah, no, exactly. I am just talking about the students I work with, which are that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's my limited perspective, not the big picture. Yeah, that's it.
But I mean, I've got that same clientele, and these patterns are very real for me. In one of the reasons I'm being so careful in the way I'm participating in this discussion at some junctures is that on one hand, I recognize a lot of the things that you're saying as being really central to the experience of these folks, of we folk, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I'm aware of how quickly things can go badly if you slap a label on a group of people at the wrong point in the process, or maybe even at all. And so, it's like walking that fine line of learning information without othering yourself or othering, you know what I'm saying, without sort of creating yet another division among us all, right? It's a bit of a dance. But the pursuit of self-knowledge is subtle. It is work, it is hard, and it's worth it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's bring this full circle and wrap this up because I got to run.
Yeah, me too. Damn you for being so interesting, Ian. How dare you?
Right back at you, man. We were talking about, right when I made that faux pas, what I was trying to get at is that, the world I want to be in is a listening world, one where it's like, let me just listen a little further beyond, because I trust humanity is good. And and being like, and what that could involve is being like, this person, his brain's messed up, no wonder they're not thinking from my perspective. And you know what? I'm here in life, if anything, I guess, if you have any kind of spiritual anything, to learn something, I think that's the currency that we should be thinking about. And people need to realize minorities, disadvantaged people have a lot of currency on that front because they've learned to think from other people's perspective and really been forced to, but like that because if you're not mainstream society, if you're an immigrant, if you're something that doesn't, right, like where it's like, this is new, you've had an incredible learning experience that a lot of people are just overlooking, and not really taking full advantage of life. Because I find the more I do that, it's like I learn more about my students than they do about me. And I feel like they're making me smarter and smarter every day, learning more and more frameworks. And I'm like, they pay me for this? Come on, get out of here. Yeah. And I think that I wish more people could have that experience and be like, if they were calm enough to laugh at people who are just so, saying things and not aware and to like, but to laugh, maybe not at, but again, to maybe like almost like start laughing as if they knew the joke in the first place, that they're aware of what they should, but underneath it, and just like get them on board by just like, oh, you know better than that, kind of thing, rather than alienation. Because if we're trying to think from each other's perspectives more, that seems like the wrong direction.
So related side point that I won't get into because we're closing out here, but
we can explore next time.
Yeah, exactly. All the best parenting
next time. Yeah.
All the best parenting classes that I've been to and parenting coaching I've had has a very similar point of view. It's like if you try to put your thumb down, and lay down the hammer on your kids, like there are countless ways in which that's just going to go in a way you don't want it to go, right? Whereas if like, oh my God, when you're in the right space and your kid does something that everyone knows the kid's not supposed to be doing, and if you kind of just give them that knowing glance and the little chuckle, like it says everything that needs to be said and everything goes better, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, oh, but they're just a kid. It's like, no, they're not just a kid. They're a kid. It's different.
They're a kid and usually very sensitive. So like they're gonna, you don't be, gentle, kind of thing, and they'll get it, right? And
they're listening.
And yeah, exactly. And use that. I mean, a kid. I mean, I don't know, but I hear what an incredible opportunity to learn is having a child, right? So like nothing better. Really.
100%, all the good and the bad. You learn all kinds of great stuff and a bunch of stuff you wish you didn't need, but yes, no, for sure. Yeah, no,
Wes, it's been great talking. Very delocalization of intelligence, guys. You can judge us on how well we stayed on topic this time.
Why don't we let them judge us on how awesome the conversation was? Because I feel like we're everywhere, and I love that about it. I love it. Anyway, it's great to see you.
Circling back, circling in. All right, we'll see you next week, Wes.
That's perfect. Thanks, Ian. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.